Hey, Scott Horton here for The Future Freedom, the monthly journal of the Future Freedom Foundation. As you may already be aware, Jacob Hornberger, Sheldon Richman, and James Bovard are awesome. They're also in every issue of The Future Freedom, and they're joined by others of the best of the libertarian movement. People like Anthony Gregory, Wendy McElroy, Lawrence Vance, Joe Stromberg, and many more. Even me. Sign up for The Future Freedom at fff.org/subscribe. It's just $25 a year for the print edition, $15 to read it online. That's The Future Freedom, edited by Sheldon Richman at fff.org/subscribe. And tell me you heard it here. All right, y'all. Welcome back to the show. I'm Scott Horton. This is my show, The Scott Horton Show. We're on No Agenda. And I should mention again that starting Monday, we're going to be 3 to 5 Eastern Time on the Liberty Express. And we're not leaving No Agenda. We're going to be on No Agenda, too. But we're going to be on the Liberty Express at libertyexpressradio.com from 3 to 5 Eastern Time is the new time and the new location starting on Monday. So tune in, 2 to 4 Texas time. Okay, next up on the show is the great Patrick Cockburn, Middle East correspondent for The Independent. And also, of course, he writes for his brother's old counterpunch.org. Welcome back to the show, Patrick. How are you doing?
Pretty good, thanks.
I appreciate you joining us today, and boy, do I appreciate the journalism you've been cranking out over the last few weeks. Took a trip to the Middle East, did you?
I was in Syria for a bit, yeah.
Well, and you wrote an article about lawlessness and ruin in Libya that seemed first person there.
Yeah, I mean, I've always been amazed by, over the last 2.5 years, how the fall of Gaddafi was portrayed as black hats against white hats, against good against bad, and then completely abandoned by the media just at the moment when Libya was sinking into sort of complete anarchy and gunmen and militias were taking over the country.
Well, but now it seems that they've stopped ignoring it, and maybe will have preferred it back when they were ignoring it.
Yeah, I mean, there are not many countries where you can sort of kidnap the prime minister without a shot being fired, and then sort of release him without anybody explaining what had happened. But it's really, it's the tip of the iceberg, or it's the moment then what's been happening in Libya suddenly becomes apparent to the rest of the world. I mean, I don't think outside the oil markets that many people noticed over the summer that Libya had stopped exporting oil because militiamen had taken over the oil ports, the oil terminals, and were demanding to be paid off before they'd let any oil be exported. In fact, they tried to steal some of the oil and transport it to oil tankers themselves. General anarchy both in Tripoli and Benghazi. A couple of tribes were fighting it out near Tripoli International Airport without anybody paying much attention. In Benghazi, been a series of assassinations. There was a protest against the Islamic militias there outside their barracks, and they opened fire and killed 31 people. All this seems to have, was very much in the margins of media reporting, and reporting from media, that was cramming the hotels in Benghazi and Tripoli 2 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Well, and of course, if they were paying attention to it, like I was trying to get at there, was if they were paying attention to it, it would just be to come up with new excuses to intervene further. There are bad guys that we have to fight there now. Can't let, as we tried to warn them, that, here we go. We can't let the guys we're fighting for win, so now we're going to have to intervene even further. I guess I prefer they just ignore it and let them settle it themselves if they can.
Yeah, I mean, that these sort of... if you take the 4, big interventions, military interventions, post 9/11, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, they've all sort of been pretty unhappy, both for those who intervened and for the people in the country, in these countries. I mean, all these interventions were justified for humanitarian reasons. We were meant to be helping them, but look at them now. Iraq, 1,000 civilians a month are being killed. In Afghanistan, the war goes on. Syria, pretty bad. And Libya, the one that was meant to be the great success, is turning out to be an almost equal disaster.
Yeah. Well, now, you mentioned the kidnapping and then the subsequent release, which is happy news, I guess, of the prime minister there. But that makes me wonder, what form of a government do they have there at all? I mean, are we talking about a bunch of, like in Somalia, where the government was just some exiles in a hotel lobby, or is there such a thing as a government of Libya?
Well, there sort of is and sort of isn't. There are people who are ministers and so forth. Unlike Somalia, there's money because of their oil, or while they're exporting oil, there was money. But it's getting sort of more and more power is sort of held by different people outside the government. The government had this idea of bringing the militias under control by bringing them into the Interior Ministry, and they would be paid by the government. But actually, the guys who kidnapped the Prime Minister this morning seem to be working for the Interior Ministry and to be paid by the Libyan government. The same was true of the Libyan Shield, the people who machine-gunned protesters in Benghazi, who I just mentioned.
They just wanted their paychecks, or what?
Power, kind of power without responsibility. I think they were getting their paychecks. I think they wanted more money, They sort of, these militias tend to start off, being kind of, defensive of their community. Often they fight very heroically, but as time goes on, they're just sort of guys with guns, and they very easily turn into racketeers and running protection and then intervening in politics and so forth. The Parliament building was besieged a couple of months ago. So the actual nominal government really doesn't have much authority. And what authority it does have really depends on its relationship with these different militias.
What do you make of the Delta Force raid to arrest this guy who was indicted for participating in the embassy bombings of 1998 over the weekend?
Well, I think, this put it up in lights that Libya doesn't really exist as a sovereign state. Governments that can't protect people within their own country, let's leave aside what he was accused of, but governments that can't protect people just sort of landing and abducting people, lose most of their legitimacy. It's rather extraordinary that the U.S. Secretary of State, John Kerry, should say, this guy, they can run, but they can't hide. This guy wasn't even trying to hide. He was living in the family house. He'd returned there. But, leave aside...
And he's been free for 15 years.
Been 15 years, people who previously held him were the Iranians, But... it seems very unclear that there's much evidence against this guy. But, let's just focus on the fact that, there is somebody living in their family house in Tripoli, and the Delta Force, the U.S. can simply land, and seize him. I mean, this is an abrogation of the sovereignty of any country. Then to openly say, well, the government sort of quietly said we could go ahead, dispraise the government. The government isn't doing its primary job. And, I think it was sort of not really made it much into the national media that people like the Mufti, the sort of supreme religious authority in Libya, had condemned this raid. Even the UN mission in Libya had condemned it. Because how can you have a sort of sovereign state when that sort of thing goes on?
Couldn't they have just had him arrested by the locals?
I don't know. Maybe, probably not, actually, because, these sort of Islamic groups that which he was a member of, had some sort of relation with al-Qaeda, the fighting group in the 90s. But these are the guys who sort of also overthrew Gaddafi, So, it also brings to the fore, this sort of contradictory policy. On the one hand, we were going to get rid of Gaddafi as this monster who's oppressing the people, but on the other hand, the guys who did were most effective on the ground in Libya and getting rid of Gaddafi are people who were, Islamists, like the guy who was picked up in Tripoli. He was fighting in to the west of Tripoli against Gaddafi. So, of course, there are a lot like him, and a lot of these others who are important in the militias in Libya were changing their pictures on their Facebook to al-Liby, to the guy who was picked up, so there's a lot of sympathy for him. So I'm not sure they could ever arrest him, but, by just simply launching a raid, that discredits and weakens any government. It sort of puts up in lights that it's a failed state.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's a fake state. It's not even from World War I. It's just from World War II, right? Libya.
Yeah, well, I think, but I don't really go with that argument. But in a sense, all governments, all states, have been added to by war. They've been put together out of this and that, But there are people who feel they are Libyan, Sure. So. It's not exactly a fake, any more than Iraq is a fake. You could say that, these were not the people were put together didn't like each other much, but, states have legitimacy because they're recognized internationally.
Yeah, and I guess there you have to have some degree of consent of the governed and people seeing themselves as part of the same society together and that kind of thing, right? Sure,
yeah. But, I think that... places like Pakistan, where the U.S. Regularly uses drones within Pakistan against Taliban and others allegedly connected to al-Qaeda and so forth, and Pakistan government sort of denounces it, but at the same time it's very well known and sort of given permission for it to happen. But, from this actually does an awful lot to discredit and reduce the legitimacy of the Pakistan government, particularly the civilian government, that they're sort of two-timing on this. It doesn't mean that Pakistan is going to have much respect for their government, although the government may think, this is kind of a smart thing to do. You keep in with the U.S., but you sort of denounce them at the same time. It really doesn't work.
Yeah. Well, now, so as far as Libya goes, do you think we're going to see more and more interventions like this Special Forces raid, or even worse, training up an army? Or something?
The other thing about this kind of raid is, you get the guys who actually aren't trying to hide too much. You don't get the guys who, are really tough operatives. So this guy is an operative for al-Qaeda. What's he doing? Sitting in his family house and driving around like anybody else. It's the same argument could be over, the assassination of scientists and others in Tehran. It's sort of implied by Israel and the others that these are really, these are the sort of J. Robert Oppenheimer of the Iranian nuclear program. But guys who are really important have bodyguards. They don't drive around in their own cars. They take different routes. They have safe houses and so forth. So I think all this boasting by Kerry and by the administration in Washington about getting these guys, is actually, it's baloney. The guys who are really important aren't sitting in their family house.
Yeah. Well, but now again, do you expect more of that, though, from the Americans? Or?
Well, yeah, I think there's a domestic political imperative to go after al-Qaeda. There is an enthusiasm or up post 9/11 in the U.S. and as I understand it, to go after al-Qaeda in a way that there isn't to get involved in wars in Syria or Iraq or elsewhere. The justification for being in Afghanistan was meant to be the presence of al-Qaeda, although they were all in Pakistan. They weren't in Afghanistan. The reason al-Qaeda was brought up was that there was public support for intervention if it was about targeting al-Qaeda. So I think that those domestic political incentives will go on. It's a popular thing to do. It's doable. It's saleable, and the administration can grandstand and say, look, we got out another of these al-Qaeda guys. They also sort of treat al-Qaeda as though, because the size of the Pentagon, we brought out the deputy operations commander. This is a few hundred guys, and, where al-Qaeda really counts is in Iraq and Syria. Which they're very serious organizations, but actually they're directed more against the Shia, entirely against the Shia Muslims, and not against the U.S. That's the big difference.
Right. Well, and by the way, I've kind of gotten in the habit, and maybe I'm oversimplifying it, but I've basically been referring to any Libyan or Syrian veterans of the Iraq War who fought against the American occupation there on the side of the Sunni-based insurgency as al-Qaeda, as though anybody basically who was a Saudi, a Libyan, a Syrian who went to Iraq to fight in that thing was a member of al-Qaeda in Iraq or the so-called Islamic State, fought with the Zarqawiites. Is that an oversimplification, or that pretty much is how it was?
Well, it's good enough to get on with. This is generally the means by which Libyans went to Iraq. These were sort of al-Qaeda type connections and money and safe houses and so forth. On the other hand, Zarqawi's outfit was, initially not connected to al-Qaeda at all. It was actually even more extreme than al-Qaeda, and as I said, was directed more against the Shia Muslims of Iraq and elsewhere than it was directed against the U.S. or the UK.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it wasn't, even though Colin Powell had used Zarqawi as the bogus link between Osama and Saddam, he, in fact, was wanted by Saddam and had told Osama no and didn't declare loyalty to Osama until the end of 2004, almost 2 years into the war.
Yeah, and also one of the deceptive things about this was saying he was in Iraq. Yeah, but he was in Iraq and a bit controlled by the Kurds, where Saddam's rule did not run. Right. Yeah, and he was there for a very good reason. He would have been arrested by Saddam if he'd been in the other part of Iraq. Yeah. So he's on this mountainous part of Iraq, of Kurdistan, not so far from Halabja, and well outside the zone of control of Saddam Hussein.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it ended up being well reported even by NBC News and others that the Pentagon had actually begged George Bush to let them go to Kurdistan and kill him before the war so that he would not be on the loose after the fall of Baghdad, and Bush refused to allow them to do it because he needed his excuse.
Yeah, I think, once you get involved in this sort of thing, and this pretense that there was a link between al-Qaeda and Saddam, I remember a big piece in the New Yorker with lots of evidence and what looked like convincing evidence, but actually it was nonsense. They'd found some guy who was a prisoner with the Kurds who said, he'd been to Kandahar and he'd talked to al-Qaeda and he'd talked to people from the Iraqi government, but it turned out he couldn't describe what Kandahar looked like. Frankly, if I was in a Kurdish prison, I'd promise anybody anything. But this was put forward as a justification for the war, and for a time was very influential.
Yeah. Well, and that's really the root of all of this. I mean, obviously history goes way, way back and everything. But the root of all evil in the 21st century is the invasion of Iraq, which destabilized every country in the region and set about, we're talking about Libya and Syria here. These wars are a direct consequence of the invasion of Iraq.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, they're somewhat similar, all these four wars, and have had a rather similar and disastrous outcome. I might also say that the media reporting has always been rather similar. It's been lots of stuff about the firefights and so forth, not much about the politics, and really not much interest about what happened when a foreign intervention goes away. It's sort of a couple of years ago, even to this day, Iraq is written about as if, nothing much was happening there. But in fact, this is a country still riven by civil war. Libya, until the last 24 hours, people weren't accepted over the killing of Ambassador Chris Stevens in Benghazi. Didn't really get much mention in the media. The fact the whole place was in an uproar, that it wasn't exporting oil, that militias were ruling the streets, really scarcely got a mention.
Right, yeah, the context. It was like a Richard Nixon limited hangout. The context of, well, what are the Mujahideen doing running around Benghazi at will in the first place wasn't being asked at all.
Sure, yeah, it's sort of, it was very inadequately reported. I mean, I was outside Benghazi in 2011, and there were And on the front line, I think there were more journalists and camera crews than there were militiamen. The main danger was getting run over by these militia pickup trucks with a heavy machine gun in the back. A shell would go off in the distance, and they'd suddenly slam on the accelerator, and you had to jump out of the way. This wasn't, what destroyed Gaddafi was NATO intervention, which means the US, UK, and France. You had a takeover by these militias, and often these were brave and committed guys. But, it wasn't the reason Gaddafi fell, so there was a great political vacuum there that the militias and the political opposition have turned out to be completely incapable of filling.
Now, on the Syria deal, as far as the chemical weapons, you've been reporting in the Independent, and you've been explaining on this radio show all along since the Syrian war broke out that there are no indications as of yet that the Assad government is anywhere near collapse. He is winning, and I guess all things being equal would win, depending, I guess, on the levels of foreign intervention against him. But my question is, with the deal over the chemical weapons being what it is, does that mean that, in effect, the Americans are backing off of the policy of regime change and they're telling Assad that he can stay? Because he's got to be the one to give them the weapons. And so far, they're saying that he's doing a real good job of giving up everything.
Yeah, isn't that an interesting change of tone by Kerry? Yeah, I think that, what's happened is that the U.S. previously and its allies its objective was, getting rid of Assad. Now its objective is getting rid of his chemical weapons, which is a big change, and something that is kind of distressing for the opposition, the Syrian opposition. Why did it change? Well, I think, the use of chemical weapons, and by the way, I really do think that it was Assad who used those chemical weapons. I mean, maybe not personally, but I think the only people who could have used it would be the Syrian armed forces. But, then suddenly the U.S. was in a position, did they actually really want to overthrow Assad? And I think when they looked at the opposition and they looked at, these al-Qaeda-linked groups that would have taken power or taken a large share of power in Damascus if Assad went, they thought, well, no, we'd prefer Assad. That's made a real sort of change in the situation. I don't think Assad was going to go down before, but I don't think he was, it was a genuine stalemate. To a degree, it still is. It's a measure of the weakness or strength of both sides that you have Damascus with government and rebel-held districts, with neither able to push the other side out to a genuine stalemate. And the only real way of dealing with this, I think, is to have at least negotiations, but at least a ceasefire on both sides. They're very dependent on outside support. And getting a ceasefire, reducing the level of violence, and then you might be able to have some talks. But you kind of need to do that. And, ceasefires are good simply because less firing, less dead bodies. You'll say, but not this ceasefire, lots of people are still shooting. Yeah, but a lot of people are not shooting. I think in Lebanon during the Civil War, a friend of mine worked out we had about 647 ceasefires, and everybody sort of laughed at them, but actually you went out on the street and during a ceasefire, and you didn't when there was no ceasefire.
Well, yeah, I guess you got to just keep trying. But now, it sounds like what you're saying is they've already achieved the state in Syria that they have in Iraq, too, which is stalemate, but still with violence, right? Where the Sunnis can't retake Baghdad, but the Shiite government America and Iran installed in Baghdad can't really conquer and really rule over the Anbar province either. And I think you reported and talked about on the show about how many of them were withdrawing from even the pretense of occupying the Sunni areas of Iraq. And then, so I wonder whether, is it the case we're already looking at a new state being drawn, or at least the dissolution of the former states of Iraq and Syria?
Not exactly a new state, but an area certainly where the states nominally in charge don't have any authority. This is wholly true of northeast and northern Syria, although there's an area where the Kurds have taken over, who are also fighting al-Nusra and the Islamists, the Free Syrian Army. In Iraq, the government still has control to a degree of some of these areas, but it's limited. It's it's more tenuous than it was. They have garrisons. The Iraqi army is real big, but their control is much less than it was in all these Sunni areas.
So, okay, overall, looking back a couple of years, with the... we haven't had a chance to talk about Egypt, obviously, and time is short. But I guess overall, can you tell us of your kind of general appraisal of the Arab Spring and America and Saudi Arabia's counter-revolution against it and how things are shaking out? Because a lot of hopes were raised pretty high,
Sure, yeah, and it's been pretty disappointing, I think perhaps particularly Egypt, because there I thought they stood a better chance of something. It didn't have quite the same tradition of violence as Iraq or Syria. It was quite developed, and there, so you have the sort of intelligentsia and the others uniting with the army to get rid of a government of Muslim brothers who, had been elected. They keep saying, but large crowds assembled, that were against it. But, elections are elections. And so I think that, it's all gone sour. But sort of basically the counter-revolution has done pretty well in these places. But it's not sort of over. It hasn't sort of settled things either. Mm-hmm. That's why, I think we're looking forward to a sort of era of wars. I don't know if it's going to be a 30 years war, but it reminds me of the Lebanese Civil War, which went on for 15 years.
Disaster. Well, yeah, I remember you said back then at the beginning of 2011 that, any real progress along these lines is going to take a long, long time to sort themselves out in this region.
Yeah, one of the problems is, I think, the way the sort of media reported it is sort of, somehow power had all gone to the people, like sort of May 68 in Paris and so forth in Tahrir Square. It hadn't. The army was still the predominant force in the predominant force there. Look, I guess we're getting to the end of that.
Right.
And
okay. I hear your phone ringing. Go ahead.
Scott.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
That's the great Patrick Cockburn, everybody, from the London Independent. And we do have to go. I was actually going to keep him overtime a little bit because I got so many more questions. But his phone was ringing and taxi theme songs playing. Hey, y'all, Scott here. The jobless rate in America keeps climbing. Food stamps and other social welfare spending continue to increase at an alarming rate. And the only thing that's kept this whole so-called recovery going at all is the Federal Reserve's inflationary printing press. Seems like 2008 might have just been a rehearsal for the financial crisis still to come. So now let me talk to you about this great video by Dr. Martin Weiss from moneyandmarkets.com. The video spells out how this disaster will affect you and create enormous financial opportunities if you know how to recognize a true diamond in the rough. Weiss shows when stocks have crashed and even gives the names of the biggest banks that are most likely to fail. Before you invest $1, take the time to watch this new video. Go to crisis16.com. That's crisis16.com. Learn from the experts how to evaluate these opportunities and start making better informed decisions that will lead to a better return on your investments. That's Dr. Martin Weiss at crisis16.com.
Fact. The new NSA data center in Utah requires 1.7 million gallons of water every single day to operate. Billions of Fourth Amendment violations need massive computers and the water to cool them. That water is being supplied by the state of Utah. Fact. There's absolutely nothing in the Constitution which requires your state to help the feds violate your rights. Our message to Utah: turn it off. No water equals no NSA data center. Visit offnow.org.
Hey y'all, Scott Horton here for WallStreetWindow.com. Mike Swanson is a successful former hedge fund manager whose site is unique on the web. Subscribers are allowed a window into Mike's very real main account and receive announcements and explanations for all his market moves. The Federal Reserve has been inflating the money supply to finance the bank bailouts and terror war overseas. So Mike's betting on commodities, mining stocks, European markets, and other hedges against our depreciating dollar. Play along on paper or with real money, and then be your own judge of Mike's investment strategies. See what happens at WallStreetWindow.com. Why does the U.S. support the tortured dictatorship in Egypt? Because that's what Israel wants. Why can't America make peace with Iran? Because that's not what Israel wants. And why do we veto every attempt to shut down illegal settlements on the West Bank? Because it's what Israel wants. Seeing a pattern here? Sick of it yet? It's time to put America first. Support the Council for the National Interest at councilforthenationalinterest.org and push back against the Israel lobby and their sock puppets in Washington, D.C. That's councilforthenationalinterest.org. Hey y'all, Scott here. Man, I had a chance to have an essay published in the book Why Peace, edited by Mark Gutman, but I didn't understand what an opportunity it was. Boy, do I regret I didn't take it. This compendium of thoughts by the greatest anti-war writers and activists of our generation will be remembered and studied long into the future. You've got to get Why Peace. You've got to read Why Peace. It features articles by Harry Brown, Robert Naiman, Fred Bronfman, Dahlia Wasfy, Richard Cummings, Karen Kotowski, Butler Schaefer, Kathy Kelly, Robert Higgs, Anthony Gregory, and so many more. Why Peace? Because war is the health of everything wrong with our society. Get Why Peace down at the bookshop or Amazon.com. Just click the book in the right margin at scotthorton.org.